Thanks a lot for a very, very kind and flattering introduction. Thank you a lot. I really was enthusiastic to come when you asked me to come, because it gave me the possibility to think about something that struck me again and again and again while working on public theology. I've done a little work on public theology and thought about reasons for theology to be public or to go public, or for religious practice with the church to understand itself as public or to go public. Reasons that might be of dogmatic nature, in the hope for the kingdom of God as a reason to go public, or notions of natural law as a reason to go public, or even also in traditions of liberal theology, the culture impacted by Christendom as a reason to go public for theologies. I found a lot of reasons for theology to understand itself as public. And in thinking about that, what struck me was this. Theology is not really that public in Germany. How many people read, and this is not personal frustration, this is just a neutral observation. How many people read a theological dissertation that is printed 150 times in order to be securely stored in libraries and returned to the author after 6 years? How many people read a theological journal article? I have not written that because I've only heard it. I heard the number of 2.3 average read a German theological article that is published. I'll have to do more research on that before I write it in here. But yes, so that's also not that many. And what was Professor Halscher yesterday mentioned Jürgen Moltmann's Theology of Hope. That makes one think. What was the last theological book that was widely discussed, like Yuval Harari's work is right now in multiple contexts? What was the last theology? When has theology for the last time been a trendsetter in public debate for a large amount of people, as today Hartmut Rosa's terminology of resonance is in Germany? A sober evaluation of all these issues will, at least for the German context, probably lead to the plain truth: theology is not really that public, at least not in the quantitative sense. When it comes to other senses of the word public, theology is of course public. Theology is done at public institutions. That's the wonderful main building of Humboldt University in Berlin, which is not only central in the city, but also at the central avenue of the city. So theology is done at public places with public money. And as I said in the beginning, and I'm sorry that that's a white man again, but even the theologian working at his or her desk, thinking of all those great imaginations, the kingdom of God or Christianity having an impact on culture, has reasons to be public and think of himself as public. While understanding itself essentially as public, and while being institutionally located at public universities in Germany, theology is practically not really that public. This might remind the malicious observer, and maybe not only the malicious observer, of Kierkegaard's polemic against the thinker. About Kierkegaard's polemic probably against Hegel, who builds a palace of thoughts in order to live in the barn right next to it. Of course, the public character of theology in the aforementioned sense, it's probably not primarily a matter of a theologian's free choice. Its public character, or lack thereof, is rather due to the complex and powerful dynamics of discourse in society. But as part of these dynamics, the way theology is done most certainly plays a role. Since theology has theological as well as institutional reasons to understand itself as public, it seems worth asking what might hinder theological practice from being more public. And that's, you may feel free not to share my diagnosis in the beginning, but if you buy into that, I'm interested in asking together with you what keeps theology from being more public, if it is so relevant to everybody. And my basic thesis is that many things, of course, play a role, but one thing that might play a role is the imaginations we have of what it means to be public. And I will explain that in while shortening it maybe, but I will explain that in 3 steps. I will first talk about the public of theology as social practice. My idea is to understand theology and public sphere not as a sphere, but as practices. And in the second sense, the public theology as imagined, well, that might be quite foreseeable. I will ask for how does theology, how do theologians in Western context imagine the public sphere, and in the last step, I have a couple of practical observations and suggestions that are fragmentary, unready, and really open to discussion. I'm exposing myself with number 3 because that's not totally secure against all kinds of criticism that could come up. First of all, the public of theology as social practice. What does it mean to understand something or oneself as public? Let's start with a very, very basic and very, very broad understanding of public, namely the one that Horst Pöttger, the scientist of journalism, has suggested. Something is public insofar as there are no obstacles to see, hear, or understand it. The term qualifies a mode of communication, and this makes possible to understand public as social practice. Public refers to something that is rather inclusive than exclusive. Terming something as public means to deconstruct excluding factors. And my understanding of practice in this sense is borrowed from a couple of sociologians of practice, and I apologize for the name dropping. That's just to say to whom I'm indebted, not to impress with names. I'm borrowing this understanding of social practice from Theodor Schatzky, who works with a Wittgensteinian approach, from Andreas Reckwitz, who has summarized theories of social practice, from Charles Taylor, who, to my view, makes it possible to combine social practice with the idea of social imaginaries, from Pierre Bourdieu, who makes a more critical perspective possible, and of course from the overviews by Frank Hillebrand, Jan Schmidt, and Robert Schmidt. What is important for me in this respect about a sociology of practice? 4 points. First of all, the understanding of practice. What is a social practice? Reckwitz defines, together with Schatzky, a practice as a routinized nexus of doings and sayings, which is connected by an implicit understanding. If we take an example that is very, very common to academical work in Germany, riding a bike, we could explain it like this. There are doings involved. I push the pedals with my feet and my hands hold the handbar. There are sayings involved. I, as a Berliner, am sometimes tempted to yell at pedestrians that loiter on the bike way. And all these doings and sayings are connected to each other, not by an explicit understanding, but by an implicit understanding. Being a kid, I have learned to ride a bike and to yell not too often. And this definition already shows what is so interesting and specific about this understanding of practice. First of all, it entails the focus on materiality, on things and on bodies. But riding a bike involves my body and it involves the thing, namely the bike. And it's not that the bike is determining what I'm doing with it, but it's also not that the bike is completely irrelevant what I'm doing with it. So it has, the bike and my body play a role in the way I use them sensibly in the course of a practice. Secondly, practical knowledge. I know how to drive a bike plays a role. And under this headline, practical knowledge, I want to integrate Charles Taylor's notion of social imaginaries. In order to drive a bike, I need some imagination of who I am and what I'm doing here. Very basically, that I have the right to ride a bike on the bikeway, that I'm a person who is allowed to do that, and that this is expected of me or less expected of me. And thirdly, practices are always socially situated. I need the money to afford a bike. On this background, we can ask the question that, I'm sorry that I'm referring again to you, but that you, Professor Hauschel, asked in the introduction to your presentation. What is a theologian doing when she or he is doing theology concretely and actually? What do we do when we do theology? And you listed reading, listening, talking, and I might add applying to funds, answering emails, traveling to conferences, organizing conference, grading papers, and maybe going to champagne receptions last night. For the purpose of my argument, and I know that that's very incomplete, for the purpose of my argument, let me group those broad range of practices into three typical groups. First of all, we have practices of exposure. Theologians present their thoughts in front of an audience that listens, or hopefully listens, or reads, and this happens in a presentation like this one right now. Those practices require certain things. They are more or less accessible. So if it comes to practices of exposure, and we ask for what public means, public for practices of exposure would mean accessibility. Are you allowed to enter this room, or is there a bouncer at the door that tries to kick you out? How understandable is what I am saying? Is the language understandable? Are the words understandable that the presenter is using? Or the other way around? Do I have the courage to stand here in front of you and to tell you something? Have I, from my socialization, learned that I have the right to stand in front of people and talk and make them listen and maybe waste their time? I don't know. But all that includes accessibility. So practices of exposure and public for them means accessibility. Secondly, practices of conversation. Theologians discuss topics orally and written. This requires the practical knowledge of knowing what kind of comments, questions, answers, and jokes are appropriate, and what kind of questions, answers, and jokes aren't appropriate. It requires embodied knowledge. I'm not yelling at you, and also not whispering in a way that nobody of you understands it. So if we engage in a theological discussion, we actualize a practical knowledge that makes it possible for us to participate in that discussion. And as soon as we change the cultural context, we learn that that is not self-evident and that we might lack the practical knowledge that is required in that very cultural context to participate in a discussion. And that already names the decisive word here, participation. When it comes to practices of conversation, I think the word public becomes concrete in how participatory are those practices. And thirdly, that's quite foreseeable, that's a person looking at the watch on a screen, which is a stupid picture, but I wanted a person who's looking in the book, but pixelate is sometimes also limited. But yes, and thirdly, there are practices of retreat. Theologians read, think for themselves, write for themselves notes that nobody will ever read. This requires practical knowledge and material resources too. I need the practical ability to focus, to sit still on a chair and put my mind to one topic for longer than 90 seconds. I need the ability to create a certain inner distance to my first emotional outrage about reading something I dislike, or even worse, like. It requires to be relieved from the pressing necessities of life, actually and mentally, at least for a while. Practices of retreat need time, and time is money, and that's not self-evident. Practices of retreat are not public themselves, but they are more or less directed to be public. What do I put my mind to in a study? Is that something that is relevant for a broader public, or is that just something that is relevant for me personally? So we have 3 different practices, and I think there are a lot of more other kinds of practices. But these 3 practices allow us to allow me to make the term public more concrete. Practices of exposure, public equals accessibility. Practices of conversation, public equals participation. And publics of retreat, that are non-public. Public is relevant in the way in which what one deals with is directed to the public or not. Looking at the watch, I will skip that and come to the imaginations. If it makes sense to understand theology as a practice itself, one cannot only ask for how publicly these practices that I just named are performed. We cannot only ask how participatory our discussions are and how accessible our presentations are. It will also make a difference what kind of public the participants in that very practice of theology imagine to be in. The imaginations that might differ from how practices actually work, but the imaginations of the participants have a huge impact and make a difference. I will try to make that more concrete with an open list of 3 examples of how the relation of theological work and public could be imagined in theology. And I will start, and that's maybe also a spleen in theology, to turn to little known people in the past and say they have a very important point. And the today maybe little cited person in the past that had a very important point for me when it comes to this is Martin Plininger, who wrote an essay on the church and the public sphere in 1948. And in that essay, he shows how the proclamation of the gospel works. Plininger starts with the silent, hidden experience that God looks at one friendly again. And this experience, made in private solitude, seeks public expression. He describes a movement from the inner heart, from the hidden interior to the exposed exterior, to the public, and uses the biblical image for that, which is quite common in that time and appears not only in him but also in Thielicke and Ewand. Jesus says to his disciples, quote, "What I tell you in the dark, say in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim on the housetops." That is an image which has not only informed the practice of preaching, but also of doing theology in general. Practices of retreat are imagined to be the place where theology is fabricated, where new thoughts are thought, where the hard work is done, where ideas are produced, where insight happens, where new insights are evaluated, checked, tested, and considered. After a thought, a theory, a model, a narrative, or an interpretation has been found reliable in the darkness of the private study, it is carried out into the light, exposed in publications. The whispered inside is proclaimed on the housetops. This imagination, oh, I have a picture for that, sorry. This imagination of theology going public works. Pictures always oversimplify and are misunderstandable. Yes, I know. And this imagination, nothing is accidental. And the imagination of theology going public works with the main basic dichotomies, from the dark to the light, from hearing a whisper to proclaiming it. Practically other parallel dichotomies are added, from the private safe space where the imperfect and fragmented may be thought, where vulnerable expressions are possible, to the public light, where concepts need to be perfect, well-informed, sealed against all kinds of possible criticism, where references need to be acknowledged in an interdisciplinary dialogue. From vulnerable production to, I would say, armed presentation. And those dichotomies between the inner and the external, the inner always comes first, and the public always is secondary. Plus, the public has something hostile and menacing to it. One needs to shield oneself before one dares to go public. The second imagination I want to introduce very, very quickly is the second imagination says that the church is itself the public sphere, maybe a counter-public sphere. Robin W. Loven has emphasized that religious communities could work as guarantors of public freedom, and drawing on Reinhard Hütter, Bernd Wannenwetsch has spoken of the church as a peculiar public generated in worship and service. And William Kavanagh has prominently criticized public theology for buying into society's notion of the public, and puts against that a genuinely theological notion of the public, which says the church is the public. Eucharist and preaching, that is what generates the public, and that's the public theology needs to deal with. And the third sense, and the way the argument is put, lets you maybe think that the third one is the one I favor most, and that's of course true. The Catholic theologian David Tracy has famously argued that all theology is public discourse. He starts with the social reality of the academic theologian and distinguishes three publics, not only the church, three publics addressed by the theologian: the wider society, the academy, and the church. Interesting about that is another point. Of course, in many of Tracy's formulations, the image of charismatic theology, the image that it is a ready-made, that theology is ready-made in private before it is brought to the light of the day resonates. But in understanding theology as public discourse, he integrates a hermeneutical as opposed to a merely instrumental notion of public discourse in his theology. Theology is not made public after it has been produced. Theology is produced publicly. The public plays a role in how theology is produced. Theology itself is a public discourse. And then he offers different ways of understanding that discourse, either with Habermas or with Gadamer, and one that I find particularly striking is his notion of conversation, which he vaguely draws from Gadamer. He says theology is generated not in a private study, but in conversation, in authentic conversation. And about authentic conversation, he says, yet what is authentic conversation as distinct from idle chatter, mere debate, gossip, or non-negotiable confrontation. Real conversation, Tracy continues, real conversation occurs only when the participants allow the question, the subject matter, to assume primacy. It occurs only when our usual fears about our own self-image die. Whether that fear is expressed in either arrogance or scrupulosity matters little. Insofar, unquote, insofar as such conversation is itself a form of publicness, some public spheres are imagined as a productive space where insights can happen, opinion can be transformed, and vulnerability can be exposed. How much time do I have left? 3 minutes. Okay. That is bad news. 3 minutes. Yes, that's a good way to shorten it. Imaginations revisited. My thesis was that imaginations can have an excluding effect. And that's true for all three of them. That is true for the discourse of the charismatic as well as the ecclesial imagination. The charismatic imagination of public theology works with a dichotomy of inner and outer sphere, which creates a filter between private and public and makes it less likely that the fragmented thing, the fragmented perspective, the vulnerable, becomes public and is exclusive, including those perspectives, and therefore exclusive, including people. And with a look to the time, I will skip the ecclesial imagination. The discursive imagination also is exclusive insofar as it favors a certain mode of speech. In Habermas' words, argumentative speech. While this helps to rendering the search for political or ethical consensus inclusive and emancipative, it also excludes certain other forms of expression, and therewith people who would favor other forms of expression. And after hurrying through these, let me finish with 3 very brief suggestions. How to do theology in these tensions in the light of those imaginations. Let me finish with 3 brief suggestions. Suggestion number 1. Theology needs more filter bubbles. Theology needs more filter bubbles. Of course, filter bubbles in digital communications are problematized and criticized for good reasons. But we could also see the very same reality differently, as Bernard Pörksen has lately suggested. He speaks of filter clash in social media and points to the fact that the public generated by mass media and by digital media is a rough spot battered by shitstorms, which doesn't invite fragmented, honest, and vulnerable perspective. But we need vulnerable, fragmented, and unready perspectives in order to have what Tracy calls conversation, a theological practice that leads to new, interesting, authentic, and disturbing insights. So, point number 1, theological practice needs more safe spaces, more filter bubbles. Number 2, theology, particularly in Germany, needs, I think, a positive image, a positive imagination of the dilettante. The dilettante, the word dilettante in German, dilettant, has become a derogatory term. In the first place, it was a positive term. The dilettante, from Latin delectare, is a person who takes joy in an art that he doesn't master. That's an idea for theology, to take joy in an art that what doesn't master. We are not the experts. We take joy in doing something we don't master. And third of all, appreciation of the particular. If the theologian's participation in practices of conversation is informed by the imagination of public theology as discourse, the theologian need not refrain to a position of the moderator of the discourse. As discourse and as part of the discourse, theology is free to take a particular position, to draw on one's particular tradition with all its particularities. In this sense, the urge to be public is also the urge to take a position, a genuinely theological position. Maybe it is not the translation of theological insights into supposedly secular language that makes theology public, but maybe it is the exposition of wisdom and beauty of the untranslated. Thank you.